that process is still in effect today. And what you find oftentimes is that, can I give you 2 horror stories?
Okay.
All right?
And we're going to move on. Let me tell Professor White, you are the DMZ, if you did not know that. You have conservatives on one side, you have liberals on the other, so you are the DMZ, okay?
I'm apolitical. I hate everybody. Well, I just give a little context to what he's saying. It's a very good point. Like when we're talking about race in politics, as he was saying, he mentioned the strategist Lee Atwater. When you're talking about how important it is as far as gaining political power, because we can't forget it's a two-party system. They're umbrella organizations. They have a winning coalition. There's a bunch of different interests that are under this umbrella and a bunch of different interests under this umbrella. So when we're thinking about how does race play into this narrative, how is racism and how are these very uncomfortable conversations that we have and continuously have playing into our political environment. So Lee Atwater, we all know about George Wallace and the integration and segregation. We all know about civil rights, but when you're looking at the political environment specifically, George Wallace went from governor to a viable national candidate on the issue of race, integration, and segregation. And the idea, when you look at the narratives and the anecdotal stuff that he said, he was basically like, I didn't know everybody hated black people. I thought it was just in the South. I didn't know I could gain political capital from having a platform that is overtly racist. And he did it, and it didn't work. And he went back to his state. If you look at his prior activity and behavior before this huge stance on race, he was actually an advocate for blacks. So the story of race is very convoluted. So it's like, if there's a condition under which a party or an elected official can gain power by saying something racist, or saying something genderized, or whatever the case may be, they're gonna do it because they wanna win. Like he said, when you have 5 strategists in your face, like, all right, you need to go ahead and drop the N-bomb one good time and you're gonna get the actual seat. As an elected official, it's like, I want the office, but what, we like to think our elected officials have moral compasses, but it's a very rational choice. It's the most prudent approach. So I wanna say, insofar as how race is playing in our politics, we need to take a more unambiguous approach, if that makes sense. And that's more, when there are racial issues, we need to address them, but try to kind of converge and dispel all of these old paradigms of using racial tactics. Because they work, we all see them, and it's like, I don't know how that's playing into my overall outcome of, whether I'm a conservative or a liberal, or whether I want to self-identify as a Republican or self-identify as a Democrat. If you look at indicators on both sides, so as an academic, there's social and there's fiscal conservatives, there's social and there's fiscal liberals. So when you think about where does race play into these, statistically blacks are very religious. One would intuitively think religious people are more conservative, but that's not the case in the black community. As he was talking about evangelical Christians, you see the most passionate and strong relationships among blacks and whites in the South. It's empirically proven within the religious context. So you have these, overall statements, oh, the South is so racist, but when you unpack that and disaggregate all of the people, it's like, well, there may be a group of racist people, and they may be larger than those in the North, but when you look at the strongest race relations, whether it be indicators of the most interracial relationships to, surveys of how many people live in your neighborhood, we are on the cutting edge in the South, and specifically South Carolina. So I really implore you to just have these conversations, these social networks of churches coming together. The North and South Church split over slavery, and they're coming back together. There was just
Professor
your first.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No worries, no. But yeah, that's my thing.
I know as a academic, I know you really want to school us, and we appreciate that. But I know, Representative Neal, you wanted to say something else, but there's one other topic I want to get into. Medicare expansion in South Carolina. Now that's a hot topic, and we've heard some on both sides of this issue. So I'm going to start with the conservative side, and I don't know what your positions are, and maybe you are for it, or maybe you're against it, but I'd like to hear what you're hearing in your circles with Medicare expansion in South Carolina. Medicaid, I'm sorry. Medicaid. Thank you.
Yeah, I've heard different sides of the argument. One of the presidential candidates, John Kasich out of Ohio, certainly took a lot of grief from members of his own party and some of his competitors in the presidential race for taking the Medicaid expansion money, and if you actually listen to him making a case why it made good budget sense to do that. And so, those are the kinds of issues where I am probably less geared towards, is it a conservative or a liberal idea, is it Republican or Democrat, then does it just make sense? There's a common sense and a budgetary reason for everything we do in government. And I think if you can make the case on that front, then you do it. If you can't, then you don't do it. But, it's sort of something that Representative Neal started talking about just a moment ago, and that is a lot of these discussions on public policy do have an origin in race. And addressing that now, you have to have that open discussion about it. We've talked about for decades in the state about why we have so many school districts and how inefficient that is. It's rooted in race. We've talked about a number of issues, Federal Housing Act and many others that date literally from the 30s, 50s, 60s, or into the 70s that overtly used race on every level. You go down to Overton in Miami, and the highway was built expressly to wall off certain black neighborhoods from the rest of the city. So look, from my standpoint, if you're going to make government work and you're going to make it work efficiently and get the best out of the taxpayers' dollars, you have to confront why we do certain things today or why we don't do certain things today. And unfortunately, not just in the South, as Dr. White said, and not just in South Carolina, but nationally, a lot of these problems we have now, they came about because the public policy itself was rooted in racial identity and racial politics. So, those are the kinds of things. Medicaid expansion, I'm more interested in knowing, once it's expanded, how much does it cost? Do we have a healthcare system that can adequately address that? And by that I mean doctors and hospitals and nurses and that sort of stuff. It's a dollars and cents thing. So
it's not a race thing, it's a dollars and cents.
I think the perception is that those programs benefit a certain racial dynamic in this country. Whether you're arguing about the effectiveness of many of these programs tends to take a back seat to just the perception of who's getting these programs. And that's unfortunate because that's, quite honestly, I don't believe, and I'm not speaking for all conservatives, I just don't believe that's a conservative approach to government.
We have 15 minutes. Hal.
Well, quickly kind of going back, if you will, to the same thought that I had before. The conservatives, and again, I'm sure there are many races that are Republicans or conservatives or whatever you call it, but I've been involved in the Republican Party for 30 years. There is not overt racism. Nobody talks about it. Probably goes to what Dr. White talked about as far as it's underneath, perhaps. But at the kind of partisan level, it usually comes down to dollars and cents. What makes sense? Why is Nikki Haley blocking, if her and others, Medicaid reform? Because they think what's going to happen is it's a little rollout from the federal government to get something to happen, and then we're going to have to then fund all this stuff. We're going to put people in a position that it's just going to be about getting. I think there was a compact in this country to take care of, there needed to be a safety net for the poor, those that truly needed it. And I don't know that anybody would argue with me about it, but we've become so bloated and so unaccountable in the way that money is distributed in different places. It's like we got to step back from it and say, what are we trying to accomplish? I don't think, Nikki Haley, I serve on her original Six Foundation, which is a private foundation, and it is totally non-political, and it's simply because she grew up in Bamberg and understood what it's like to live in rural South Carolina. And I go in and I see what's going on, and rural hospitals are in danger of going out of business. But that goes back to the Hospital Association when Affordable Care Act was coming together. They made a deal because they thought we're going to get all this money, it's going to be good for us, and so all the political things that started blocking it, that created a crisis because, again, I go back, poor people are being hurt because of the politics around Medicaid reform. And so from a conservative standpoint, the idea is let's look at the system the way it is. What can be fixed? What can we change in goodwill, not by the partisans, not by the people trying to, win points and use these issues to make their case to get elected, but just as citizens who say, wait a minute, I want to take care of the poor. And if Medicaid is one of the ways that I make sure that they get health care, how do we do that? What are the problems? And I think conversations between true conservatives, who I think really do want to help the poor, but they want it to be based in a kind of fairness and work, kind of a work ethic basis. It says if you're able-bodied, work is good, work. If you have needs and you need to be taken care of, we're going to make sure there's a safety net to take care of you. It's become broken because people are defending systems that aren't working anymore and not willing to look at new systems. So that's part of the problem.
Representative Neal.
I hardly know where to begin. When I think about Medicaid expansion in the state, we have almost 200,000 people in the state with no access to health care. I give Health and Human Service credit and the governor credit for looking for ways to expand Medicaid outside of the Affordable Care Act. And there's been a movement of about 150,000 or better of non-insured people into the old Medicaid system since Obamacare reared its head. But let's be honest, the opposition to the Affordable Care Act is not just because of conservative concern about cost. As one of my colleagues from Horry County said, the opposition to that program is due to who's in the White House. And he says anything that comes out, we're going to oppose because of who's in the White House. And I asked him, well, what do you mean? He says, well, there's a black man in the White House. And we're never going to support anything that he puts up. It's that simple. I think that there is that element to this, politically, that is unfortunate because people are paying a high price for it in not being able to access health care. I think we need to be clear that in South Carolina, this state formulated public policies starting with its own state constitution, 1895, which was designed to make sure that black folks didn't gain political power in this state. Moved from there to reapportionment, where South Carolina has created the equivalent of political apartheid by gerrymandering these districts in this state, packing black voters into ultra-black districts and purging white districts of black voters to a point where we now don't really have a truly representative form of government in the purest sense. What we have are political Bantustans for black folk packed into these districts. And the overall outcome in terms of public policy is one where white legislators generally cannot connect with the concerns of black voters because they don't really represent many of them. It means that there's a divide that has evidenced itself in the public policy life of this state and this country because of those realities that we have got to figure out how do we get around. The U.S. is the only developed nation in the world that does not have single-payer health care, the only one. And while we debate these issues of whether we can afford it or not, the reality is that the rest of the world has figured out how to do that. The developed world has figured it out and have been doing it for generations. We still are not able to come to grips with it, and as a result, people die who otherwise may not have to die if they had access to health care. For me, it is an issue of whether or not we as a society and a political establishment come to grips with the realities that we're dealing with. We can continue to not talk honestly with each other about what really is going on and what motivates us. And as long as we continue to do that, we will never solve these problems. I think race is an issue that will require us to have thick skins on both sides, to be able to talk about these issues and the impacts of our own individual prejudices and our collective prejudices as well, institutionally, and to look for remedies that are substantive and reality-based. Otherwise, we're just dancing around the edges and it will never really change.
Ms. Watts.
And I'll also say this too, you know, it's funny that we talk about a healthcare type battle because it seems like every time there's been a monumental Democratic president who's done something with healthcare, there's been this huge debate. We saw it 80 years ago with Franklin Delano Roosevelt creating Medicare. We saw it 50 years ago with John F. Kennedy fighting for Medicaid. And now we're seeing it this time around with President Obama. I want to share with you just a quick personal story about, because before 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I would have thought health concerns, oh, I'm kind of young, I'll worry about that later, 20 years down the road. But what really happened, and this is what happened to me, in 2011, there was a lot of debate about Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. What people saw was insurance rates went through the roof. My insurance rate, and there's only two people on it, myself and my husband. We own our own small business, and we had one other full-timer. The rest, we have a lot of part-timers. We were helped to one respect because the full-timer was the wife of a military veteran, and she was very well set on health care. But 2011 rolls around, and I'm used to paying about maybe a little bit under $1,000 a month for the two of us insurance rates. Little did I know that was kind of high. The 2011 rates come in, and my new insurance rate will go up to $1,800. $1,800. Now that doesn't sound like maybe a lot, but when you multiply that by 12, that's $21,600. And I had a choice to make. I could either keep my health insurance for myself and my husband, or I could fire the one full-timer I had. And so Nigel and I made a decision. We're going to swallow hard and pray and drop our insurance and just hope, beyond hope, that we stay healthy. That went fine for 2011. 2012, some things started happening towards the end of the year. And then 2013, Nigel was diagnosed with AFib. We thought he was having breathing problems. We thought he was having, we didn't know what was going on. And little to find out there was a family history of that, and then that's what caused it. And thankfully, the good people of Providence took excellent care of him. But after that, in 2013 was when they rolled out sign up for ACA. I was shocked at the difference in the rates. And to this day, I'm in my second or third year of it, because I am an ACA, and I'm proud of a proud supporter of it. We are paying less than $500 a month. I think it's $400 and some odd dollars and change. So yeah, I do think that there's definitely a political battle. It's been going on over time for a long period of time. And I'm not trying to, pour gasoline on any hornet's nest here, but I don't necessarily believe that those on the other side who are fighting President Obama so much on the Affordable Care Act really, I think they need to fess up and say that there is a racial element of things, because it does affect disproportionately African Americans. And if you don't believe me, then look up the voting registration statistics for any Republican member of any House or Senate, and I guarantee you will not find that number eclipse 22%. Why? Because 22% is not a winnable number for a Republican candidate or a Tea Party-esque candidate. So in the end, for me, I do take it very seriously when people attack President Obama on the Affordable Care Act, because I think what's happened is, and Democrats are guilty of this, I will honestly admit it, when they were holding all those town hall forums and the Tea Party was gaining strength, the Democratic response was not a good response in 2009 or 2010. And it became what it became. And that's why we have the scars that we have today on it. And we probably will continue to have the scars on until another generation or two gets comfortable with it. Just like they got comfortable with Medicare under President Roosevelt, they got and Social Security, and they got comfortable with Medicaid under President Kennedy.
Henry, could I say one thing? I know we're going to run out of time. I just want to say to Representative Neal that I don't know if it's because Obama's black, but I don't know the hearts of a lot of people. I wanted to ask you, I mean, from my perspective, I don't know if I'm a typical Republican or conservative. I don't know there is a typical anything out there. But do you sense, going through this debate on the flag after the tragedy in Charleston, and you know very well, you've been there a long time, you know a lot of white legislators, do you feel like there is some sentiment in that body to do things differently than they've done in the past? All the blocking, all the games that are played, the guys that tell you I'm not voting for anything a black president wants to do. Because frankly, I don't think there are a lot of Republicans, conservatives, again, I don't think, because I never see or hear from them personally, that want to keep somebody in office that thinks like that. I think those are, that to me, we've been fighting these battles, and I think we kind of reached a place where, Dr. White talked about it, we're just so divided that it's like, I want to throw your hands up and let's start all over again, because, most all the things that you've said have been eminently reasonable today. I agree with most. I think we're talking today in this forum in ways as how do we move this thing forward, understanding that politics is a blood sport and you got to deal with winning and personalities and all that. But I think most of us do. I'm just a lay guy. I'm not in office. I just want to see us. Actually, Sam Tenenbaum, I saw the other day, used the word, and I'll credit him with it, is he started to call himself a solutionist. And that's kind of vintage, Sam Tenenbaum. It's like, how are we going to get things done? So
that's a good question, Hal. We have 3 minutes, and what I want to do is have each of you, we're going to stretch it just a little, folks, take about 60 seconds. We've talked about voter ID. We've talked about the race card. We've talked about whether or not race has a stake, or do we see race playing a part in how policies are set. We've also talked about the Medicaid expansion. We know we have problems in South Carolina. We know that it appears to me, even you agree that there is probably the undergirding problem is distrust. You don't trust each other. We don't trust each other. How do we solve the problems that we know we have in South Carolina so that everyone has an equal stake and equal access to the pie? I'll start with Mr. Watts. 60 seconds.
60 seconds. Best solution
Or
I
less.
could give you is when I was a kid, I was in 10th grade. By the way, my high school letterman's jacket looks like a bowl of alphabet soup. I'm serious. I went to 3 high schools. Went from a high school that only had 1 African-American student in my sophomore year, moved down to West Palm Beach, Florida, and went to a high school where I was one of 15 white students. And this is my solution, is purposely put yourself in the opposite frame of reference that you live in and that you see things through. If you really want to get a true understanding, think of not necessarily how it affects you, but think about how it affects the neighbor that's across the street from you. Think about how it affects the left-handed person as opposed to your right-handed mentality. That's what I would suggest, is purposely go out there, find different backgrounds and different people that you can exchange conversations with.
Representative Neal, how do we fix it?
Well, I think what we saw happen with what happened in Charleston was a beginning of a sort, because what it did was to shock us into recognizing that we're all human and we're all here together. and we were all equally reviled by what we saw and experienced there. I think that was the reason why the flag came down. We could relate to one another as human beings around that issue of the slaughter of those people in Charleston. But where do we go now? The flag was a symbolic issue. We now need to begin talking about substance. That means talking about how government functions. Our institutions need to be examined for a disparate impact. We need to be talking about how we change those institutions in a way that matters so that we don't end up continuing